$230 million. That's the exact staggering number sitting on the other side of the scale today, weighing heavily against a rookie-scale contract worth only a small fraction of that total amount. And for the first time throughout this entire competition, that enormous number might genuinely not be enough anymore to save the exact job it was originally signed to guarantee. Todd Monken stood in front of a room full of cameras and said something about Shedeur Sanders that instantly, completely reframed this entire quarterback battle, using language he had genuinely never once used to describe Deshaun Watson at any single point throughout this entire summer. And while that specific, glowing praise was spreading rapidly across every single football show and social media feed in the entire country, a completely separate, far more complicated reality was quietly, steadily closing in on Watson, one that has almost nothing to do with football itself and everything to do with a tangled financial situation this organization has been carefully avoiding confronting for well over a year now. Stick around, because what's actually happening to Deshaun Watson today goes far deeper than simply losing a quarterback competition. Before we break down exactly what Monken said about Sanders, and exactly what Watson is actually facing right now behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately, because the financial reality buried inside this decision is something almost nobody is talking about, and it changes everything about how this entire situation plays out. Let's start with Monken's message, because the specific language he used matters just as much as the praise itself, and this wasn't some vague, feel-good compliment tossed out to a young player. Breaking down Sanders' performance after the Buffalo game, Monken got detailed. He said there's a lot there to like, pointing specifically to the confidence Sanders plays with, and crediting him for getting significantly better at getting rid of the football compared to earlier in the season. He didn't stop at surface-level praise either. He specifically credited Sanders' improvement in climbing the pocket and working through his full progression of reads, breaking down one specific throw to receiver Luke Floria where Sanders drifted a little deep but still delivered the ball cleanly even after essentially creating some of his own pressure by holding the play a beat too long. And then, when reporters pushed him further on exactly how he coaches Sanders' operation, the details he gave were even more revealing. Monken talked about cadence specifically, explaining that Sanders had drawn Buffalo offside earlier in that same game, nearly cashing in on a shot downfield because of it, and that on a different snap, the offense had actually caught Buffalo in the neutral zone too, a rep Sanders is still learning to fully capitalize on. He was refreshingly honest about where the rough edges still are, pointing to a 3rd and 12 situation where Sanders had to check the ball down instead of taking a shot because he didn't see the flag drop in time, and admitting that overall, cadence execution that had been sharp in the first half simply wasn't good enough by the end of the game. That kind of granular, specific breakdown, praise and criticism delivered in the exact same breath, is precisely what makes this feel like a coach who's actually evaluating a player he believes can start, rather than one still deciding if the player belongs on the field at all. There's also a smaller, more personal quote from Monken that's been circulating just as widely, one that captures the relationship between these two in a completely different way. Describing the specific challenge he's given Sanders heading into this final stretch, Monken said he wants him getting in and out of the huddle a little cleaner, being a little faster with his decision-making, adding, with a bit of dry humor, that it would mean he as a coach doesn't have anxiety coaching him. That's not the kind of line a coach uses about a player he views as a lost cause or a long-term project still years away from being trusted with a full offense. That's the kind of line a coach uses about a player he's already comfortable enough with to joke about, publicly, in front of the entire media covering this competition. Think about what all of that actually means coming from a first-year head coach in the middle of a genuinely unresolved competition. Coaches at this level rarely offer this level of specific, technical detail about a player unless they're actively building a real evaluation case, one way or another. For Monken to break down individual plays, individual cadence reps, and individual moments of growth this consistently, across multiple separate press conferences throughout this final stretch of preseason, tells you exactly how seriously he's come to regard Sanders' readiness heading into a decision that's now happening today. And that praise arrived at the exact moment it carried the most weight, immediately following Sanders' final preseason start, where he opened the game with 8 consecutive completions against a Buffalo Bills defense that finished dead last in the league in passing yards allowed a year ago. Working behind a second-team offensive line, with only one legitimate starting-caliber receiver on the field beside him, Sanders still delivered the cleanest, most composed stretch of quarterback play this entire training camp had produced. Monken's praise wasn't abstract encouragement handed out to make a young player feel good. It was a direct, specific breakdown of exactly what that performance revealed on tape. Now let's turn to the other half of this story, because while all of that praise was dominating headlines, an entirely different, far more complicated situation has been quietly building around Deshaun Watson. And this part of the story has almost nothing to do with what happened on the field this preseason. Watson is currently attached to one of the largest fully guaranteed contracts in the history of this league, $230 million, the majority of which has already been paid out regardless of performance. That contract was signed with championship expectations attached to it. Instead, across the years since signing it, Watson has been limited by suspension, multiple serious injuries including 2 separate Achilles tears, and increasingly public questions about whether he can still function as a starting caliber quarterback in this league at all. This preseason did nothing to quiet those questions. Across 2 total appearances, he completed just 16 of 27 passes for 162 yards, with an interception and a fumble mixed in, numbers that would be concerning for almost any quarterback, let alone one still carrying the financial weight of a record-setting contract. Here's where the shocking reality actually comes into focus. Reports have confirmed that the Browns technically retain the ability to release Watson outright if this organization decides that's the right path forward. But doing so isn't nearly as simple as it might sound. Cutting him now would trigger significant salary cap consequences stretching well into the 2027 league year, a financial hit that would follow this organization for seasons regardless of who ends up starting at quarterback in the meantime. That's the trap this front office is genuinely caught inside right now. Performance on the field says one thing. The contract sitting on the books says something completely different. And today, as this decision gets finalized, both of those competing realities are colliding at the exact same moment. That collision helps explain why Watson's own post-game comments following Saturday's loss became such a significant story in their own right. When reporters asked him directly about the boos raining down from his own home crowd, comments that painfully specific, that emotionally raw, don't happen by accident. Watson described that reaction as disrespectful, pointing out that the last time he took meaningful snaps on that exact field, he tore his Achilles tendon, and that same fanbase, in his own words, cheered when it happened. Monken addressed those comments the very next day, choosing not to let them factor into the actual decision, describing it as a moment where emotions simply got the better of a competitor who works hard every single day and genuinely wants to return to form. But whether that separation between Watson the football player and Watson the frustrated public figure actually holds up once this final decision gets made is exactly the kind of tension defining this entire day. So here's the shocking reality Watson is actually facing today, layered underneath the simple question of who starts week 1. Even if Sanders wins this competition outright, which growing public sentiment increasingly suggests is the more defensible outcome given performance alone, Watson doesn't simply disappear from this roster or this cap sheet. The organization still has to decide whether keeping him as an expensive backup makes more sense than absorbing the financial pain of moving on completely. That means today isn't just about naming a week 1 starter. It's about an organization quietly beginning to answer a much bigger, far more expensive question that's been looming over this franchise since the day that contract was signed. Meanwhile, Sanders' path forward looks almost the exact opposite. A 5th-round pick already outperforming expectations tied to that modest draft slot, now receiving direct, technical praise from his own head coach that places him in conversation with legitimate Hall of Fame caliber talents. If he does end up winning this job today, it becomes one of the most remarkable value stories in recent NFL draft history, a player nearly every team in this league passed on multiple times over, potentially becoming the long-term answer at the single most important position in the sport for an organization that has failed to solve that exact position for the better part of 2 decades. Put those 2 stories side by side, and today reveals itself as something much bigger than a simple depth chart announcement. It's a franchise being forced to reconcile what actually happened on the practice field and in these preseason games against what was promised, financially and competitively, when Watson first arrived in Cleveland years ago. Monken's glowing, specific praise for Sanders makes the football case increasingly difficult to ignore. But the tangled financial reality still surrounding Watson means today's announcement might only be the first domino in a much longer, much more complicated process still playing out behind closed doors. Whatever gets decided in the coming hours, this much is already clear. Todd Monken didn't just compliment a young quarterback this week. He may have just tipped this organization's hand on the football side of this decision. And Deshaun Watson isn't just fighting to keep a starting job today. He's facing a far more complicated, far more expensive reality that extends well beyond this single quarterback competition, one that this entire organization is going to have to navigate regardless of whose name gets announced as the Week 1 starter. We'll be tracking every single update as this situation continues developing, so make sure you're subscribed for everything that's coming next, because today is just the beginning of a much bigger story for this entire Browns organization. Let's dig a little deeper into exactly why Monken's cadence-focused breakdown carries so much extra weight, because it goes beyond simply praising arm talent or raw physical tools. Drawing a defense offside, working the neutral zone, recognizing exactly when a flag has dropped versus when it hasn't, these are the kinds of small operational details that separate quarterbacks who are simply talented from quarterbacks who are actually running an offense at the level this league demands. That's a very specific, very deliberate framework for evaluating a quarterback, not a generic compliment picked at random. It suggests Monken sees Sanders as close enough to game ready that the remaining gaps aren't about arm talent or physical ability at all, but about the kind of fine operational detail that typically closes fast once a player gets enough live reps against a real, live NFL defense. Now let's return to the financial reality surrounding Watson, because understanding exactly how the Browns front office arrived at this specific, complicated crossroads requires looking back at how this contract actually came together in the first place. Cleveland sent multiple future draft picks to Houston to originally acquire Watson, then signed him to a fully guaranteed deal unlike almost anything else in the sport at the time. That structure was designed to protect Watson from exactly the kind of performance-based release decisions most other quarterback contracts allow for. It worked exactly as intended, protecting his financial security through injuries, legal proceedings, and a prolonged suspension. But that same protection is precisely what makes today's decision so much more complicated than a typical quarterback competition resolution. In a normal situation, a front office simply moves on from underperforming, expensive investments once a cheaper, more productive alternative clearly emerges. Watson's contract removes that simple option almost entirely, at least in the short term, forcing this organization to weigh long-term financial consequences against what's actually happening on the field right now, in real time, this week. That tension explains why national analysts have been so split on what the Browns should actually do, separate entirely from what they will do. Some argue the football decision is now painfully obvious, that continuing to start a quarterback who's shown this level of decline, this level of inconsistency, simply isn't defensible anymore regardless of what's already been invested financially. Others argue the opposite, that walking away from that level of guaranteed money without exhausting every remaining opportunity to see it pay off would represent a genuine organizational failure, separate from whatever happens on the field this specific season. Both arguments carry real weight, and both explain exactly why this decision has dragged out as long as it has, with Monken publicly admitting he needed extra time specifically to weigh out everything sitting in front of him. There's also a human dimension to Watson's situation worth remembering here, separate from contracts and cap numbers entirely. This is a player who has spent years trying to rebuild his career and his public image simultaneously, dealing with the physical toll of two separate Achilles tears while also facing constant scrutiny that follows him into every single public appearance, every interview, every post-game press conference he's forced to sit through. His raw, emotional response to being booed on Saturday, however it eventually gets remembered by this fanbase, reflects genuine frustration from someone who clearly understands exactly how precarious his current standing with this organization actually is right now. That frustration doesn't change the football evaluation happening today, but it does add real emotional weight to a decision that's already carrying enormous financial and competitive stakes simultaneously, layered on top of each other in a way few quarterback competitions ever have to navigate. So as this announcement gets finalized, the actual outcome today represents only one piece of a much larger, more complicated puzzle this organization is going to be managing for months, possibly years, to come. If Sanders gets the job, this front office still has to figure out exactly what role, if any, Watson plays going forward, and how to manage a locker room watching a former franchise centerpiece adjust to life as a backup carrying a record-setting contract. If Watson somehow retains the job despite everything that happened this preseason, this organization braces for immediate, significant backlash from a fan base that has already made its frustration unmistakably clear, while still eventually having to answer, at some point down the road, whether that financial investment was ever going to pay off the way it was designed to. Whatever gets decided in the coming hours, this much is already clear. Todd Monken didn't just compliment a young quarterback this week. He may have just tipped this organization's hand on the football side of this decision. And Deshaun Watson isn't just fighting to keep a starting job today. He's facing a far more complicated, far more expensive reality that extends well beyond this single quarterback competition, one that this entire organization is going to have to navigate regardless of whose name gets announced as the Week 1 starter. We'll be tracking every single update as this situation continues developing, so make sure you're subscribed for everything that's coming next, because today is just the beginning of a much bigger story for this entire Browns organization. This video is created for entertainment purposes. All information shared is based on publicly available reports, team statements, and ongoing developments as of the time of publishing, and details may change as the situation evolves. This content is intended to celebrate and discuss these athletes and organizations respectfully. No disrespect is intended toward any player, coach, or organization mentioned.